Welcome to our time in the Word. I'm so thankful we can share this moment of devotional together. And today we're looking into the topic God hears in 2 Kings 19. We'll be looking at verses 10 through 19 and verses 32 through 34. Again, that's 2 Kings 19, verses 10 through 19 and 32 through 34. Prayer is an invitation into the very throne room of God. This invitation is about having a conversation with the creator of the universe and being ushered into his presence as someone he desires to spend time with. God wants to hear from us and to show us his wisdom and his plans. Just like any other invitation, we must choose to accept it. But too many times, we expect God to act and to do so without us first approaching him. Today, we're going to see a very different story to that scenario with Hezekiah and the scenario that he has as he stands and tries to take his stand against the king of Assyria. But to understand the full impact of all that's going on here today, we need to look at the context of everything that's happened up to this point. We're going to be looking at 2 Kings 18, 1 through 21, and then also 2 Chronicles 29, 1 through chapter 33. So, uh, again, if you want to really go back and see the full scope of everything, it's in 2 Kings chapters 18 through 21, 2 Chronicles chapter 29 through most of 33. But to summarize it like this, Hezekiah became king. And when he did, he acted to turn Judah back to God. Early in his reign, Assyria came in and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. The king challenged the priests and the Levites to help him bring about spiritual renewal. Hezekiah then restored the sacrificial system, and the Levites and the people of God praised and celebrated. The king then invited all Israel and Judah to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. Many northern citizens mocked Hezekiah's invitation, but others came. The people celebrated the Passover at a level they had never done since Solomon's days. When Sennacherib of Assyria invaded Judah, Hezekiah initially capitulated to the king's demands. He gave in and he initially said, okay, I need to get underneath this guy. But Sennacherib sent a large army and a delegation to Jerusalem to encourage surrender and to warn the people not to trust Hezekiah's assurances of deliverance. Well, Isaiah told Hezekiah that God would rescue Judah, but the Assyrian official returned and again warned the people not to let either Hezekiah or his God deceive them. He used those words, deceive them into believing they could win. Hezekiah went to the temple and prayed fervently for God's deliverance. Isaiah then sent a second reply to Hezekiah and assured him of Assyria's impending defeat. Isaiah even went on to say that life in Judah would soon return to normal. God would defend Jerusalem for his own sake and for the sake of King David. And so an angel of the Lord decimated the Assyrian camp that night, and Sennacherib turned home. When Hezekiah became ill, later on, Isaiah told the king he was about to die. But God extended Hezekiah's life by 15 years after Hezekiah prayed. Unfortunately, the king became proud when the Babylonian delegation visited him, and foolishly he showed them everything he had, all of his wealth, all of his stores, everything. Isaiah told Hezekiah that one day the Babylonians would return and exile Judah's citizens. Hezekiah's son, named Manasseh, succeeded him and reversed his father's policies. He reestablished Baal worship. He rebuilt the false worship sites his father had destroyed. God's prophets warned that disaster would come upon Judah because of the king's sin. Manasseh eventually repented and turned to the Lord after the king of Assyria captured him, though much spiritual damage had already occurred. Amon, Manasseh's son, continued Manasseh's evil practices and reigned only 2 years before he was assassinated. Well, now that we know the context, let's look today at the text. Let's start with 2 Kings 19, verses 10 through 13. The first thing we see here is the taunt. The taunt. Starting in verse 10. Say to Hezekiah, the king of Judah, do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. When King Hezekiah first reported the Assyrian ultimatum to Isaiah, the prophet had encouraged the king not to fear. But the king of Assyria then sent a second delegation to Jerusalem, and that delegation brought an even greater taunt. He used these words, say to Hezekiah, king of Judah. This preferenced the message that the king had sent. Probably the messengers had given this message orally. And then they may have even given it in writing to the same group that had received the earlier message. They likely delivered it loud enough for all to hear, as they did the first message they had delivered. The Assyrians could work diplomatically, but they also knew how to work through intimidation. Typically, when the Assyrians came, they would come and they would give a city or a society the opportunity to go ahead and surrender first. And if they didn't, they would bring in their army, and then things would get really bad because their army was just merciless. You can read some histories of the things that the Syrian army would do, and it was frightening just to even think about. In other words, everyone who knew the Assyrians were coming for them knew that if they didn't surrender up front, the Assyrians would make them regret it. They would make them pay for it. So this was a very real threat and a very frightening situation for the inhabitants here of Jerusalem. So the Assyrian spokesman here, he says, do not let the God you depend on deceive you. The spokesman's words here signaled a turning point in the narrative. In his first encounter with the Jewish delegation, he had encouraged them not to let Hezekiah mislead them. Now the focus was not on Hezekiah, but on Hezekiah's God. Initially, Hezekiah's honor was at stake, but now God's honor was at stake. We don't know why the Assyrian delegation may have thought that God was saying Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Maybe the Jewish delegation had mentioned Isaiah's words to the Assyrians, but this is probably not the case. Maybe the Assyrians were simply working an educated guess. That's more likely that the people might have considered this. After all, in his first message, the spokesman had suggested Hezekiah had angered his God by smashing God's high places throughout Judah. Of course, this was actually a good work that Hezekiah had done, but probably many of the common people had perceived this as not good, especially when the Assyrians heard of this particular occurrence. Well, now let's look at verses 11 through 13. Surely you've heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries, destroying them completely. And will you be delivered? Did the gods of the nations that were destroyed by my predecessors deliver them? The gods of Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who were in Tel Assar. Where is the king of Hamath or the king of Arpad? Where are the kings of Lair, Sepharvaim, Hena, and Eva? The word here surely signified the importance of what the spokesman was about to say. He asserted, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries. The language of the original here stresses that Hezekiah's personal knowledge of the devastation of Assyria's prior conquests and what it had done to those countries they had conquered. The spokesman then answered his own question, destroying them completely. In light of the Assyrians' perfect record of victories, the spokesman asked Hezekiah, will you be delivered? The original language here stresses the word you. In other words, in his taunt, the spokesman was calling Hezekiah to consider carefully the potential implications of his choices. Did he really want to challenge the mighty Assyria? In other words, he was saying, King, you can be personally responsible for the complete and total destruction of your nation and the deaths of countless number of your subjects. It's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of things to consider. There was a lot on Hezekiah's mind. The Assyrian spokesman continued his taunt with another question. Did the gods of the nations that were destroyed by my predecessors deliver them? The question here was rhetorical, of course. He wasn't asking for the location of these conquered kings here, but he was stressing that these kings existed no longer. Hamath was a significant city in Syria here north of Damascus during the days of the divided kingdom. The region had made peace with King David and with King Jeroboam II, the king of the northern kingdom. Arpad was closely connected with Hamath and was also a leading region of Syria. It, along with Hamath, had fallen to Tiglath-Pileser. He's the one who conquered Damascus in 732 BC, the mighty king of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser. The cities of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Eva seem to have also formed a part of the Syrian territory as well. The Assyrians had conquered everyone in their path so far, including the northern kingdom of Israel and its capital, Samaria. And now they wanted Hezekiah to consider Judah will be next. Well, we've often heard pride goes before the fall, and that's true in so many cases. And we hear here there's a lot of bragging that the Assyrian representatives are doing here. And if you look at it from a worldly standpoint, they had a right to brag. They had a lot to brag about. They had literally conquered every nation they set out to conquer. There was no one who could stand against them. But pride often leads to greater acts of arrogance. And the more victories the Assyrians won, the prouder they became, and the more they thought themselves invincible. But God was about to humble them. Likewise, successes that we have today, whether in local church ministry, in marketplace ministry, in our own lives, in our careers, in our family situations, all of these things can tempt us to pride. We must remember that God has given us all that we are, and He has given us all that we have. For it is by His power that we accomplish everything that we do. When God gives us success, we should give Him the glory. Well, now let's look at the prayer that happens next. Remember, Hezekiah is under a lot of pressure here. Let's look at the prayer. We'll be looking at 2 Kings 19, 14 through 19. All right, let's look at verse 14. Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. Then he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers. That's the first thing we're told here. This letter gave the terms of the Assyrian ultimatum, and Hezekiah read it, already knowing essentially what it contained. He knew he faced desperate circumstances. And so what he did was a good response. He went up to the temple of the Lord. King Solomon, Hezekiah's ancestor, had prayed there that God would respond to desperate circumstances such as these. Hezekiah took the Assyrian letter and he spread it out before the Lord. He knew that the Lord knew its contents, but the king's tangible actions helped him to process the situation personally. Sometimes we need to take similar tangible actions, lay it out, present it before the Lord, take it to the altar. So many times we used to say, bring it to the altar. And there's a lot of value in that. Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, knowing Judah's future was at stake. He began by affirming the Lord's uniqueness over all the lands and over all the universe. He addressed him as Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim. These words, enthroned between the cherubim, reference the Ark of the Covenant and the angelic cherubs that adorned its top, where God's presence sometimes manifested himself. We've seen that in Exodus 25. The expression here denotes God's closeness to his people. Hezekiah also affirmed to the Lord, he said, You alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. The Assyrians embraced this idea of polytheism. That is, they believed different gods controlled different nations. And the Assyrian spokesman here even suggested that the gods of Assyria were stronger than the gods of other nations. Hezekiah affirmed that God has absolute sovereignty over all of earth's kingdoms. He also affirmed to the Lord, You have made heaven and earth. The structure here of his response emphasizes God's personal involvement in the creation process. He created it all, he controlled it all. Hezekiah knew it, he realized it, he declared it, he laid it out before the Lord. Listen to what he says as he continues on in verses 16 through 19. Verse 16, Give ear, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, Lord, and see. Listen to the words Sennacherib has sent to ridicule the living God. It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations and their lands. They've thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them. For they were not gods, but only wood and stone, fashioned by human hands. Now, Lord, our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. Hezekiah called the Lord's attention to the scroll by laying it out. Give ear, Lord, and hear. His words may have suggested he was reading this Assyrian threat aloud before God. Furthermore, Hezekiah urged, Open your eyes, Lord, and see. Hezekiah's use of these verbs called God's attention to the urgency of the situation. Hezekiah's plea, listen to the words Sennacherib has sent to ridicule the living God. This closely paralleled David's words that he spoke concerning Goliath. Remember those words that Goliath stood in front of the Israelites as they were cowering behind the lines and ridiculed God. But David rose up and he killed Goliath because David was offended when Goliath taunted Israel's army. God's honor was at stake. And now Hezekiah was offended that the Assyrians mocked God. Once again, God's honor was at stake, and so was the destiny of the nation of Judah. The Assyrian spokesman earlier had highlighted Assyria's record of victories. Hezekiah recognized this with the words, It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations and their lands. Hezekiah also agreed that the Assyrians had thrown the gods of these nations into the fire. As the Assyrians achieved victory over nation upon nation, they had humiliated these nations. In their minds, their god, Ashur, was more powerful than the gods of the other nations. But Hezekiah declared the false premise behind the Assyrians' reasonings. He said, They were not gods at all, but only wood and stone. They were fashioned by human hands. Hezekiah goes on to affirm his belief and his knowledge that God alone is God. Idols are just simply the work of human hands. In Psalm 115, the psalmist also describes the pointlessness of serving idols because they have no life in them. In Isaiah 44, Isaiah also condemned God's people for foolishly thinking about the power of idols over their lives. Hezekiah's words here, they destroyed them. They simply affirmed that the Assyrians had destroyed idols of wood and stone, that in and of themselves they were powerless anyway. They had not faced any God like the Lord, but soon they would know. Hezekiah goes on and pleads, "Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand." The words Lord our God stresses the Lord's personal relationship with his people. Hezekiah implores God here to deliver them so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. Certainly, Hezekiah knew that if Judah fell, he would likely die. Nevertheless, he first and foremost called for God's glory among the nations. Kingdoms and people who had been unable to withstand the Assyrian onslaught would witness God's victory over the mightiest army in the world. When they did, Hezekiah knew they would know such a victory that could only come by the power of Judah's God, because no other God or nation had been able to defeat Assyria. As believers, we can and we should humbly approach God in prayer, especially in great times of stress and distress in our lives. The prophet Isaiah described how God takes note when we come to him humbly and respect his word. He talked about this in Isaiah 66 and verse 2. Hezekiah came to God asking him to intervene so the nations would see his glory. Likewise, when we come to God in prayer, pleading for specific answers, our desire should be for his glory. He is greater than we are, and his ways and his thoughts are far beyond ours. Isaiah reminds us of that in chapter 55, verses 8 and 9. Ephesians 3:20 reminds us that he can do beyond all that we can ask, think, or imagine. But he also will not share his glory with another. How might God show his greatness through a serious challenge that you or your family, how can he do that you might be facing now? Is God greater than what you're facing? Does everyone around you know nobody else could conquer this, but look, there's something about this God that they know. There's something about this Jesus they know. Maybe God's waiting for you to ask him to show his glory in that situation. How easy it is for us to pray, Lord, deliver us. Paul even prayed 3 times. He said, Lord, take away this thorn in the flesh. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Can the glory of God be shown in your difficult situation? That should be the focus for our prayer. Well, now let's move on to the next section. We see next the answer in 2 Kings 19, verses 32 and 34. Verse 32. Therefore, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with shield or build a siege ramp against it. The words, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria here, it introduces the Lord's impending judgment against the proud king of Assyria. Sennacherib had arrogantly mocked the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. He had boasted of his many accomplishments, but he did not realize that God had made him who he was. God knew everything about Sennacherib, and he would lead him home in disgrace. The Lord of armies, whom Sennacherib had mocked, would accomplish this. Isaiah's message described particular acts of warfare Sennacherib would fail to do. First, he said Sennacherib will not enter this city as a victorious king. Second, not he or anyone in his army would even so much as shoot an arrow here. Invading armies often used archers to send barrages of arrows over a city wall to keep the citizens pinned down while the soldiers moved closer to the city. It's a blanketing technique that's even used in warfare today to send in. Today, instead of arrows, we send in missiles first or bombs to kind of soften up the area so that the troops can move in and do their work. Third, Sennacherib would not come before it with a shield. Invading armies often approached the city also with its troops bearing shields to repel the counterattacks from the city walls. And fourth, Sennacherib would not build up a siege ramp against it. Invading armies would employ a battering ram against a city gate, but they also might build up a ramp against the city wall so soldiers could get over the wall into the city. But none of these tactics of warfare would happen, not a single one, because God was in control of the situation. No matter how hopeless your situation may look in your life, God is in control. That should give us comfort today. Let's go on in verses 33 and 34. Verse 33, by the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter this city, declares the Lord. I will defend the city and save it for my sake and for the sake of David, my servant. See, Isaiah's message contained a summary statement about Sennacherib. By the way he came, he will return. He will not enter this city. Sennacherib will return to his land without claiming Judah. That's an important piece of information that he received here. This word declares the Lord. It puts a final exclamation point on God's verdict against Sennacherib. The Lord promised, I will defend this city and save it. Hezekiah had prayed that God would intervene and reveal his power to the nations, and God had answered the king's prayer. Indeed, the Lord affirmed that he would defend Jerusalem for his sake. God would come. He would come here, and his glory would be shown. And Sennacherib would know that God is the God of Judah when he went home in disgrace. God also promised to save the city for the sake of David, my servant. God had made David a promise in 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 through 16, concerning David and his house. And Hezekiah, who was one of David's descendants, had shown himself faithful to the Lord in keeping with that promise. So, consequently, God would bless Hezekiah and save the city. David had died approximately 270 years earlier, but God's promise remained true. What God had promised remained true, and that's true even today. God's promises are always true. We can always count on them. We can always depend on them, for he never changes. That's a great promise for us today. 2 Kings 19, verses 35 through 37 records that God's victory over Sennacherib actually did take place, and it records what happens. Interestingly, here in this, Sennacherib described his invasion of Judah and battle with Hezekiah in his own royal inscriptions. He claimed that he shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. He probably had a veiled concession here that he couldn't take Jerusalem. God heard the faithful king's prayer, and he brought dramatic deliverance. And God still brings glory to himself through this account as we study it today. God will defend his name and he will defend his people. Sometimes we wonder why we see so many people mocking God and his ways in today's world. But God's word assures us that a day of judgment is coming for the wicked. Psalm 37:13 emphasizes that for us. The Lord will choose to defend his own honor in the manner he chooses, whether through life's ordinary events or once and for all at Jesus' second coming, as we look forward to that as described in 2 Thessalonians 1, verses 6 through 10. Either way, God will hear his people's prayers and he will act on their behalf. God is intelligent. He is spiritual. He is forever a personal being. He will never change. He's the creator. He's the redeemer. He's the preserver. He's the ruler of all. And you can trust him no matter what circumstance you may be facing in your life. Well, thanks so much for joining me for today's time in the Word. I pray this study will be blessed to your heart. The Lord will bless it as He has to mine and your heart as we had this time of devotional today. As a reminder, starting in September, I'll be launching a weekly Bible study video series entitled Time in the Word with Pastor David. Post times will be the same. They'll be posted on my personal YouTube channel and Facebook page. I'm even looking into turning those video audios into a podcast if you're a podcast listener. As I'm retiring from in person ministry, I'm shifting, as we say, a retreading into a focusing more in an online ministry. As I've said before, these 30-minute Bible study videos, they take me a little over an hour, sometimes an hour and a half to do because of having to pause and take care of my lungs and coughing and all that I do. But thankfully, the Lord has given us this technology that we can use to be able to accomplish this form of ministry and still have that ability to minister to others in the future. I encourage you, if you're watching on YouTube, to click subscribe and to click that little bell icon down there to be notified whenever a new Bible study video is posted. And I also, if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, I encourage you to like and to comment on the video so I can know you watched and to be able to hear from you and hear your insights. It blesses my heart to be able to know that you are able to share this devotional with me. And until next time, be sure to have your own time in the Word each and every day.